Have you ever found yourself really lost in one of humanity's oldest stories?
Hmm.
You know, those myths, legends, passed down forever, full of these incredible events, things that seem totally impossible.
Oh, absolutely. And you start to wonder, right?
Yeah. Like, what if some of those ancient tales weren't just pure imagination, you know?
Yeah.
What if they actually held whispers of real things that happened?
It's a really fascinating idea, isn't it? That buried inside these narratives, these very human stories, there might be bits of actual history or maybe observations about the world that our ancestors figured out way before modern science.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we're diving into today. We're going deep on ancient myths, especially focusing on that great flood story you hear about everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And we're exploring where science, like modern discoveries, seems to line up surprisingly well with these old accounts.
Yeah, we've gathered quite a bit for this. Got historical documents, ancient tablets, actual cuneiform stuff, plus, modern scientific papers, exploration reports. It's quite a mix.
So our mission really is to sift through all this, see what insights pop out, what connections we can make, and what this meeting point of old stories and new science might tell you about how we understand our past.
Okay, so let's start unpacking. Maybe the biggest one, the most famous myth that seems to be everywhere, is the Great Flood, and of course the story of the Ark.
Right. And our journey into this one actually starts, kind of unexpectedly, with an aerial photo taken way back in 1959 over Turkey.
That's the one. An army captain, İlhan Dürüpınar, was flying a mapping mission for NATO over this pretty remote mountainous area near Mount Ararat. There'd been earthquakes, shifted the land around.
And he's up there taking pictures and spots something just totally weird, out of place, like a boat shape.
Exactly, a boat shape etched into the land, but way inland, high up too, like 6,500 feet above sea level.
I mean, just bizarre.
Yeah, and when those photos got developed, this striking feature, symmetrical, roughly the size of a huge ship, well, it sparked immediate, intense interest. Like, what is that, and why is it there?
And your mind just snaps, doesn't it, straight to the story in Genesis, in the Bible. Probably the most famous version of a great flood.
It's a powerful story. God sees how wicked humanity has become, decides to basically reset the earth with a flood, and instructs Noah, this one righteous guy, to build a massive ark.
And the instructions are super specific. Which wood to use, the exact size, like 515 feet long, 86 wide, 51 high, multiple floors, rooms.
Yeah, the whole blueprint.
The whole blueprint. And the point is to save his family and pairs of every animal to, restart everything after the floodwaters go down.
And the story goes, the flood lasts 40 days and nights, covers even the highest mountains, and then eventually the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat.
Which is key because Mount Ararat is a real place, a huge volcanic mountain range in eastern Turkey.
Right, not far at all from where Captain Dürüpınar saw that shape in his photos.
So for ages, people maybe thought of the flood story as like an allegory, right? A moral tale.
Symbolic.
But then you have this story popping up in other ancient texts too, the Torah, the Quran, and then you have this weird geological thing near the very mountain mentioned. Suddenly, it's a whole new ballgame.
Yeah, it really ignited a huge debate. Could this be actual physical proof, evidence that the biblical story was literally true? Could that formation be the Ark?
And what would that even mean if it was?
Well, that search for answers, for proof, it actually led researchers down a different but related path. It turned out the flood story wasn't just in those texts. It was older, much older.
Okay, this is where that little clay tablet comes in, right? Found, or rather brought to light, in 1985.
That's it. Tiny thing, like 4 inches high, covered in cuneiform, that wedge-shaped writing.
And it came from a private collection.
Yeah, a guy named Leonard Simmons, a British Air Force vet. His son, Douglas, brought it to the British Museum. And Dr. Irvin Finkel, the curator there, who's an expert in this ancient Mesopotamian script, he saw it and was, floored.
Because it wasn't just like a shopping list or tax records.
Exactly. The museum has 130,000 tablets, and loads are just everyday stuff. But Finkel realized this was different. This was literature, epic literature.
And as he translated it?
He found a flood story. He recognized it. It was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh, okay. That's one of the oldest pieces of writing we have, period. From ancient Mesopotamia, right? Like 4,000 years ago.
That's the one. And smack dab in the middle of this epic poem is a flood story that sounds incredibly familiar. It's got this immortal guy, Utnapishtim, and the gods tell him to build a giant boat gather animals, and survive a world-ending flood.
No way. So, just like Noah.
Pretty much. Divine warning, build a boat, save the animals, massive flood, boat lands on a mountain. In Utnapishtim's case, it's called Mount Nimush.
The parallels are just stunning.
They really are, and here's the kicker. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with Utnapishtim's story, was written down maybe 1,000 years, possibly even more, before the version in Genesis.
Wow. So it wasn't necessarily multiple cultures independently coming up with the same flood myth.
It seems much more likely, based on this, that the Noah story is, a descendant, a later version of that much older Mesopotamian tale. The story got passed along, adapted.
Which then makes you ask, okay, if the story is that old and traveled that far, did something actually happen? Was there a real event behind it all?
That's the logical next step, isn't it? Because huge disasters, massive floods, they tend to leave marks on the land. Geological evidence.
And scientists have found evidence for a truly massive flood event right in that part of the world.
Yes, exactly. This takes us to research around the Black Sea.
Tell us about that.
Okay, so back in 1997, a team led by William Ryan and Walter Pittman, they were studying the geology and history of the Black Sea.
And what did they uncover?
They found evidence for what they called the Black Sea deluge. Really compelling stuff. Well, they found things like shells from freshwater snails and even traces of ancient shorelines and human settlements buried deep under the saltwater bottom of the current Black Sea. And dating this stuff suggested it all got submerged around 5,000 to 6,000 BC, so maybe 8,000 years ago.
So the Black Sea wasn't always saltwater.
That's the theory. It suggests the Black Sea used to be a much smaller, isolated freshwater lake, and it sat significantly lower than the world's oceans, especially the connected Mediterranean Sea.
Okay, so like a basin way down low.
Exactly. And remember, this is after the last ice age. Glaciers are melting, sea levels worldwide are rising.
Right.
So the Mediterranean Sea's level goes up and up until eventually it breaks through. It breaches whatever natural barrier, like a strip of land, was holding it back from the lower Black Sea freshwater lake.
Like a dam bursting.
A natural dam, yeah. And the descriptions based on their research are just mind-boggling. They calculated the inflow of salt water was like having 200 Niagara Falls pouring into that basin.
200?
Every single day for about 300 days straight.
I can't even picture that amount of water. What would that have done to the lake?
It would have risen incredibly fast. The shoreline would have been advancing inland maybe a mile a day if you lived near that freshwater lake's edge.
Your home is underwater in hours. Gone.
Pretty much. Before the levels stabilized, this flood supposedly inundated an area about the size of Colorado.
Wow. Okay, so maybe not a flood covering the entire planet at once. Geology suggests huge floods happened at different times in different places, but maybe not one single global event like that in recent history.
Right. But for the people living around that lake 8,000 years ago, this Black Sea event would have felt absolutely apocalyptic, like the end of the world.
You'd think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the idea Ryan and Pittman proposed is that the survivors, the people who escaped this rapidly rising water, they scattered. And they carried the memory, the trauma of this unbelievable event with them.
Passing the story down. Generation after generation.
Exactly. And that shared story of survival, maybe morphing and changing as different cultures told it, could very well be the seed, the origin of those widespread flood myths we see later, like Utnapishtim and Noah.
That is a really compelling link between a specific, scientifically documented regional catastrophe and this incredibly persistent ancient myth.
It provides a plausible mechanism, And just as a side note on the ark itself, it's interesting. One source mentioned some engineering students, I think at Leicester University back in 2014.
Yeah.
They actually ran the numbers on the dimensions given in Genesis for the ark. And they figured out that, a vessel that size built that way, it could actually float. Now, whether you could fit 2 of every single animal species on board, that's still a bit tricky.
Right. The biological logistics are maybe a separate issue. But the physics, the basic seaworthiness.
Yeah.
Potentially viable.
Potentially, yes.
So the Great Flood story, one of our oldest, most widespread tales, possibly rooted in a terrifyingly real regional disaster from thousands of years ago. That connection alone is pretty mind-blowing.
It really is. And what the sources we looked at suggest is that this isn't like a one-off thing. This pattern of ancient stories, myths, containing observations or descriptions that seem to resonate with modern science, it pops up elsewhere too.
It really makes you wonder what else might be hiding in plain sight in these old narratives, doesn't it? Let's explore some other examples the sources brought up.
Okay. Well, we see some interesting connections just in how ancient texts talk about the earth itself.
Right.
Take the book of Job, for instance. It's incredibly old.
Right.
And there are passages in Job that, well, they sound surprisingly modern, like Job 26.7 describing the earth as basically hanging in empty space, unsupported.
Which, before telescopes and space travel,
Yeah.
how would you even conceive of that? You'd think it needs to sit on something, right?
Exactly. Or Job 28.5, which talks about the earth having fire or intense heat deep inside it. Again, how would they know that without deep drilling or understanding geology? It's pretty striking.
Definitely. What else?
There are passages that seem to describe the water cycle. You know how water moves around the planet. Ecclesiastes talks about rivers flowing into the sea, but the sea never gets full, and the water returns to where the rivers came from.
Like evaporation and rain feeding the rivers again.
Precisely. And Job mentions water being drawn upwards and then falling back down as rain from the clouds. It's a basic description of evaporation, condensation, precipitation concepts that weren't formally laid out by science until much, much later.
And didn't Isaiah mention the earth being circular?
Isaiah 40.22, yeah. It talks about the circle of the earth. Now, okay, ancient Greeks like Pythagoras also figured out the earth was a sphere, but the description, circle, it really resonates with that image we have now from space, like the Earthrise photo, this blue marble hanging there.
That visual connection is strong. Okay, so those are kind of broad planetary observations. Do the sources mention anything more specific? Like linking myths to actual historical events or puzzles that science later shed light on?
Yes, definitely. Think about David and Goliath. Classic underdog story from 1 Samuel.
Right. Shepherd boy takes down the giant warrior. Seems purely miraculous.
Well, maybe not purely. One interpretation looked at the practicalities. David was a skilled shepherd, used a slingshot daily. The valley they were in apparently had stones rich in barium sulfate, which are unusually dense.
So more stopping power.
Potentially, yeah. Calculations suggest a dense stone from a powerful sling could have the impact force similar to, say, a .45 caliber bullet. And then there's Goliath.
The giant.
Some theories suggest he might have had acromegaly. It's a condition causing excessive growth, gigantism, but it can also cause vision problems like poor peripheral vision.
So if David approached from the side, Goliath might not have seen him clearly until it was too late.
It's a plausible scenario. It doesn't take away from the story's meaning, but it offers a potential, natural explanation woven into the legend, science providing a possible mechanism.
Interesting. Any others like that?
There's Psalm 104, which uses poetic language about mountains rising and valleys sinking. Some read this alongside other mentions of the sea as possibly reflecting an awareness of dramatic underwater topography. Like seamounts, these huge volcanic mountains that rise from the deep ocean floor. We only really mapped these properly relatively recently, but they're massive geological features teeming with life. Could ancient seafaring people have had some inkling of them? Maybe.
And what about that story in Joshua, where the sun supposedly stood still?
Joshua 10.112. Yeah, the sun standing still to give more daylight for a battle. Sounds impossible, right?
Completely.
But a couple of scientists, Humphreys and Waddington, published a paper in 2017 suggesting it might describe something else. An annular solar eclipse?
How would that work?
An annular eclipse is when the moon passes in front of the sun, but it's a bit further away in its orbit, so it doesn't completely block the sun. It leaves a bright ring, the annulus. So the sun's light dims dramatically, but doesn't go out entirely. It might appear to stop in its usual course, or the light quality changes drastically. And they even tried to date it. By cross-referencing the text with historical records and astronomical calculations, they proposed a specific date for an annular eclipse visible in that region, October 30th, 1207 BC.
Wow. Trying to pinpoint an eclipse described in an ancient battle account. That's trying to bridge a huge gap.
It really shows how scientists are looking at these old texts now, searching for potential connections to real, datable events.
And it's not just Judeo-Christian text, right? This pattern shows up in myths from all over.
Absolutely. The sources highlight this across cultures. Think about Atlantis. Plato wrote about it.
The ultimate lost city myth.
Right. Maybe Atlantis itself wasn't real exactly as described, but we have found real ancient cities underwater. Cities submerged by rising sea levels after the Ice Age, or destroyed by disasters like the volcanic eruption on Santorini. That wiped out the Minoan civilization there, a real advanced Bronze Age culture suddenly gone. Events like that could easily fuel legends of lost lands.
Just like Troy, people thought that was just a story from Homer for centuries.
Until Heinrich Schliemann actually went looking and found it. And even now, with satellite imaging, scientists are confirming these lost cities deep in the Amazon jungle, places previously dismissed as myths by outsiders.
Or reality catching up to legend.
Sometimes, yeah. Or think about practical knowledge hidden in myths. Greek myths about Hephaestus, the volcano god, probably help people understand and respect the very real dangers of volcanoes in the region.
A way to personify and remember a natural hazard.
Exactly. And traditional medicine is full of this. Ancient Egyptians and Greeks used honey on wounds, it's mentioned in their lore. Now we know honey has genuine antibacterial properties.
Right. And so many modern drugs come from plants used in traditional Chinese or Indian medicine for centuries, often tied to their own myths and beliefs.
The knowledge was there, wrapped in a different framework.
What about, like, mythical creatures?
Oh, yeah, that's a fun one. Dragon myths, found all over the world. Some think they could have been inspired by early discoveries of dinosaur fossils. Imagine finding huge, strange bones before anyone knew about dinosaurs.
You'd invent a creature to explain them. Makes sense.
Or mermaid stories. Probably sailors seeing manatees or dugongs, large, vaguely humanoid marine mammals from a distance, maybe in poor light.
Right. Wishful thinking meets a blurry shape.
And the Kraken. That myth of a colossal squid attacking ships. Pretty much confirmed when we finally documented the existence of actual giant squid, which are enormous and deep-sea dwellers.
So it seems these myths weren't just random stories people made up for fun.
It really doesn't look that way. They suggest ancient people were often incredibly sharp observers. They watched the stars, the weather, the land, animals. They remembered big events. Even if they explained them through stories about guides or spirits, the core observation or the memory of the event was often accurate.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this, pull it all together. What's the big takeaway from seeing this pattern, this alignment between ancient myths and modern science?
Well, I think first it tells us these myths were incredibly important. They weren't just entertainment. They were like cultural databases, ways to store knowledge about the world, about history, about survival, how to deal with floods or earthquakes, or which plants might heal you.
Passed down through narrative, which is easier to remember than dry facts.
Exactly. It also suggests we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss ancient wisdom as just superstition. Sometimes buried in those beliefs were genuine observations about how things work, observations that science is only now confirming with its own tools and language.
So science isn't always disproving myths. Sometimes it's actually revealing the real thing that inspired the myth in the first place.
That seems to be happening more and more. It shows that our understanding of the past, of human knowledge, even of the planet, it's constantly evolving. We find new ways to look at old information.
It really highlights that history isn't necessarily a closed book, is it? These stories we've had for millennia might still hold clues, hidden truths, just waiting for the right discovery or the right perspective to unlock them.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder, I think. There's always more to learn by looking at that intersection, that space where human stories meet objective reality.
This whole deep dive has really been eye-opening. Seeing these connections, these threads, linking ancient narratives to modern scientific discovery, it's quite something.
It really is. It makes you see these myths not just as folklore, but potentially as, like you said, signposts, pointing towards real events, real observations, maybe even knowledge that got lost somewhere along the way and we're only now rediscovering.
Absolutely. And, that leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to leave you, the listener, with something to chew on after this is over. If so many of these ancient stories, these myths we thought we understood, actually contain these kinds of hidden truths that science is only now starting to confirm, well, what other legends, what other dismissed beliefs or ancient accounts might just be waiting for that future discovery, that next scientific breakthrough to suddenly prove them real? What do you think?